You're listening to a talk by Ralph Schoenman. He's the executive director of the Bertrand Russ Peace Foundation, and this talk is called "The Hidden History of Iraq and Kuwait." It was recorded in March of 1991.
The war against the peoples of the Arab East is not over, let me assure you of that. It's not a war that began on August 2nd, let alone on January 15th. The great Afro-American revolutionary Malcolm X, in one of the last speeches that he gave in New York prior to his execution in February of 1965, said that the importance of history to us is critical, that history of which we have been systematically deprived. Our politics are controlled, our economy is controlled, and we have no say about our future. And so Malcolm said, you have to have a knowledge of history no matter what you're going to do. Anything that you undertake requires it. In fact, he said, the one thing that puts you and me at a disadvantage is a lack of our knowledge concerning that history. Well, the North American poet Ezra Pound put it like this. He said that the technique of infamy is to invent two lies and to get people arguing heatedly over which one of them is true. And that has pretty much defined the way in which we have been bombarded by falsehood and by deception on the part of the media since the inception of this particular conflict. Mind you, I don't want to demonize the media because, in a sense, we're talking about but one other corporation. All of the mass means of communication are controlled by banking holding corporations, by the great conglomerates, and those who work in those institutions are, in essence, no different than people who work for any other. They have to make their way. They survive essentially within a totalitarian structure. The boss tells them what is expected of them. Everybody knows implicitly what it requires to get a promotion or to be favored or to be well looked upon. Notwithstanding that, the working press from time to time does indeed file stories that see the light of day. In fact, if you're aware of some of the history of the movement against the war in Vietnam, there was in that period an organization called Clergy and Laymen Concerned that published a book called In the Name of America, consisting of those dispatches filed by the working press that never saw the light of day. So in attacking and putting on trial, in a sense, the media in the United States, we should be clear that what we're again talking about is not those who attempt to survive and work within it, but the institution as controlled by the powers that be. It was not so long ago that the U.S. Department of Treasury released statistics establishing that 2% of the population of the United States owns and controls some 90% of the national wealth. They average 14 corporate directorships per person. By any criterion, that's an oligarchy, a ruling order. Robert Townsend, who was formerly the president of Avis and American Express, wrote a book called Up the Organization. And Townsend attempted to identify those functionaries, those administrators, those people who have hegemony over the commanding heights of the U.S. economy on behalf of this 2%. He identified them as approximately 5,000 in number. Townsend said that they look upon the United States as their private whorehouse and a president as their towel boy. Well, look, we have about 5% of the people of the world within our national frontiers. Yet U.S. corporations control nearly 2/3 of the planet's natural resources. So we have 2% of 5% that commands 2/3 of the resources of the planet. The enforcement arm for that empire, the armed forces, the intelligence agencies, the whole apparatus of coercive control is essentially placed in motion to preserve that structure of power. What we've been experiencing in these last months with respect to the Arab East is not new. It's but the little continuation of the despoliation of that sector of the planet in order to command control over its resources. The New York Times described Kuwait as a family-owned oil company with a seat in the United Nations. Well, what are we talking about here? A small, feudal, oligarchical family of 200 people, 18 billionaires. According to the official data, they had controlled something on the order of $300 billion in assets, which are managed by Chase Manhattan, Citibank, Morgan Stanley. They manage these billions on the U.S. financial markets, and essentially it's deployed to subsidize the deficit of the U.S. Treasury. And while you're always dependent, after all, upon those who have indeed these assets to presumably disclose, and we know that we're looking at but the tip of the iceberg, a piece in the New York Times on December 30th of last year indicated to what extent we underestimated the holdings of this tiny 200-person family in Kuwait. Here's the piece. The estimate may be low, but the ruling family's vast overseas property holdings and $2.8 trillion deposited in foreign bank accounts mean that the government in exile is unlikely to have any problem paying for its needs, like its phone bills and so on. $2.8 trillion. The entire debt of this huge industrial colossus, the United States, is some $3 trillion. $2.8 trillion. And in a region where there are 250 million people, for the most part living below subsistence level. As King Hussein of Jordan, who's hardly in the forefront of revolution, put it, if there were carrots in Kuwait, there wouldn't be 500,000 troops in Saudi Arabia. So if you want to have an understanding of what this is really about, we have to look at the structures of power. Who has it? How is wealth derived? How is it managed? How is it organized? In whose interests? What are the social structures that are serviced by it? The peoples of the Arab East have been in a almost continuous struggle since the last century to assert some form of national sovereignty, some modicum of self-determination, some measure of control over their own natural resources, to create an infrastructure that would permit them to have what? Schools, housing, medical care. If you read into the current issue of Time magazine the account of the largest bank in Washington, D.C., the America's Bank, an $11 billion bank, and what has recently been revealed about it, we begin to get an idea of what these relationships are. That is a front bank. That bank has been fronting for the Commerce and Commercial Credit Bank, which is the holding company that has been processing the proceeds from the Colombia drug lords in conjunction with the covert operations of the Central Intelligence Agency. We now see that one of the principal funders of that operation, that holding bank, whose facade was maintained by such as Clark Clifford, advisor to John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Jimmy Carter, the sort of grand old man of the Democratic Party. It's the ruler of Abu Dhabi who initially funded that holding company that facilitates both covert operations and the distribution of drugs in the inner cities of the United States. It's extraordinary to find this now, these relationships described in the pages of the New York Times and Time magazine. Those of us who have been discussing it for years were considered slightly unhinged. But here is the Manchester Guardian Weekly on the nature of the Emirates in the Gulf, the Arab Gulf or the Persian Gulf, as the press chooses to call it. The ruler of Dubai, Sheikh Rashid bin Saeed Al Maktoum, Vice President and Prime Minister of the United Arab Emirates, has a number of sons. His eldest son, an heir, Crown Prince Sheikh Maktoum bin Rashid Al Maktoum, is one of the deputy prime ministers. His second son is the Minister of Finance and Industry since 1973, chairman of the Emirates Currency Board, governor of the Islamic Development Bank in Jeddah. His third son is the United Arab Emirates Minister of Defense and head of Police and Public Security. The fourth son is the former Minister of Defense and Colonel-in-Chief for the Dubai Defense Force. And the Sheikh's wife, Sheikha Latifa, is related to the ruler of Abu Dhabi. An even more concentrated and tiny little feudal collection of corrupt families installed by force, maintained by force, whose primary service is to extract capital and send it out. New York Times described the House of Saud, and if you think about that, Saudi Arabia means Robinson's or Schoenman's Arabia. It's a family-owned country. William Quant of the Brookings Institution said Saudi Arabia is a family-run business, and business has been good. The assets of this Saudi family, not to include those outside its borders, are estimated at exceeding $400 billion. And the boundaries, the article says, between the Saudi state treasury and Saudi personal coffers is rather permeable. It's a polite euphemism for thievery. What these relationships really represent have been spelled out by Yusuf Ibrahim in the New York Times last April 30th in a piece called Royal Investment Overseas, a Vast Empire. And he spells out the holding companies, the banks, the major corporations, from Ford to General Electric to General Dynamics to General Motors, in which these funds are channeled. But in particular, what he points out is that these are essentially funds that comprise flight capital. $800 billion of flight capital. When measured against the national domestic product, this foreign flight capital is even more striking. The growth of Arab flight capital continues even as the debts of the Arab nations pile up, Arab governments borrowing on a larger scale than ever before. But the flight capital depriving these countries of domestic sources of capital. The pool of flight capital from these indebted Arab nations is enormous. By every estimate, that means a greater degree of pauperization in Egypt than was existent under King Farouk. So try to have an understanding of what the peoples of the Arab East feel when they see these corrupt little satraps installed and maintained by force from afar, literally pillaging their societies. And by the way, the mode of rule is anything but benign, as one might imagine. The San Francisco Chronicle on February 26th disclosed Pentagon plans for the U.S. role in post-war Kuwait, based upon a classified Pentagon document. United States military forces will assume full control for up to 5 years and perhaps even longer, we're told. The 200-page document says martial law measures will be in effect and will be extended up to 1 year at a time by the Kuwaiti government. Even after martial law, all political restrictions that existed before the war, including press laws banning criticism of the emir, will be instated. Moreover, there will be no funds for medical care for non-citizens. Well, non-citizens are 60% of the Kuwaiti population. Moreover, even Kuwaiti citizens will not receive any longer medical care. The plans call for only treatment of 150 patients a day. $2.8 trillion, but in this little duchy, this handful of people who are called citizens will not be entitled to a modicum of health care. Kuwaitis will be now issued with identity cards and screened for interrogation. Camps will be built for Iraqis and other potential terrorists. That is to say, anybody who raises an eyebrow. Specifically, there will be a ban on criticism of the emir, quoting from the emir without his permission, publishing information about the national currency, creating misgivings about the Kuwaiti economy, or criticizing other Arab leaders. Unquote. Liberated Kuwait. So you see, this has vanishing little to do with Saddam Hussein. $2.8 trillion was engendered not by Saddam Hussein. The feudal families were not installed by Saddam Hussein. They were not maintained in power by Saddam Hussein. We've been lied to from the beginning as to what is at stake here and what the issues are in relation to this conflict. Now, you will recall that the Pentagon has issued a series of briefings in Dhahran, and a servile press has been asked to literally sign on, to put their names at the bottom of a censored military report prepared by the military of the United States in the course of a war of decimation. And faithfully, they told us that the impact of the bombardment that was being inflicted upon Iraq was de minimis. What they euphemistically label collateral damage was incidental. Mohammed Taghi Mudarrisi, who is a member of the Iraqi opposition and in no way a supporter of the regime, documented in Damascus that the number of victims of the air bombardment of Iraq, civilian victims, had surpassed 100,000 in the first 4 days. The German Social Democratic deputy Manfred Opel, deputy in the Bundestag and a former general of the Army, Air Force general of the Army Air Force, confirmed that over 100,000 people died in Greater Baghdad and 300,000 within Iraq, civilian deaths from the bombardment. These figures were confirmed by American military experts and were published by Agence France Presse on the 23rd of January. All over Europe, this data has been available. Agence France Presse is the equivalent of AP in the United States. Vanishing little indication in this country of the devastation. But consider, in a space of 4 weeks, a greater degree of explosive tonnage than in the entirety of the Second World War over a small country of 17 million people. The European theater, the Pacific theater, the entirety of the Second World War bombardment exceeded in 4 weeks. The Los Angeles Times carried a story by Mark Feynman on the 5th of February. Refugees from Iraq describe hellish scenes. The massive bombardment has demolished every communications center, all oil refineries, all government buildings, and most civilian neighborhoods, depots of food and medical supplies, according to eyewitnesses. The result, a hellish nightmare of fire and smoke so dense that the sun has not been seen for days at a time. In the besieged capital of Baghdad, the airstrikes continue to hit a second and a third time. These skies have been so crowded and congested that the planes have to circle as if over Los Angeles airport every 10 minutes to drop their bombs. Leveling entire city blocks and civilian neighborhoods. Bomb craters the size of football fields. Untold numbers of casualties throughout war-torn Iraq. No water to drink. No civilian communications. No power. No transportation network. For drinking, the residents are collecting rainwater from ponds and bomb craters and filtering it through shreds of cloth. Images of human devastation of the most massive aerial bombardment of a nation since the U.S. carpet bombing raids on North Vietnam some 2 decades ago. The article says, these accounts, backed by hours of videotape footage, confirm the devastation of civilian neighborhoods in Iraq's major towns and cities. The videotapes, with hundreds of images of civilian casualties, limbs protruding from piles of residential rubble, dolls strewn atop twisted furniture, civilians rushed to hospital emergency rooms where there is no electricity or water, blanket-covered corpses on sidewalks, crumpled swing sets, and battered playgrounds. One witness is telling the reporter, I have seen so many bombs dropping with my own eyes, stones and smoke, continuously like the blasting of a volcano, everything demolished. They are now attacking mainly the hospitals, the big warehouse sheds with food and grains. Basra, fully under clouds of smoke. In the last 4 days, we have not seen sunshine. The situation is very bad. The bombing never stops. You can see nothing, only clouds and dust. Inside the city, outside the city, fire everywhere. It is no place to live. It is a place only to die. 5 days later, again in the Los Angeles Times, Baghdad's anguish and anger grow as civilian deaths mount, as does belief that allies want to destroy Iraq. For the past 2 weeks in Baghdad, Dr. Rizik Jabbar Abu Kashif has performed major surgery by candlelight, amputating the legs of children without painkillers or blood transfusion, watching hundreds die from infections for want of antibiotics or clean water for rehydration. Such is life in besieged Baghdad. The whole time I am thinking we are in the 14th century, said Abu Kashif. There is no X-ray film for blood typing. There is no water, no electricity, no telephone, no water even for scrubbing before surgery, and bombing all day, all night, every day, every night. Hassan Bayaji, an Iraqi in his mid-40s. There are no cold corpses. When you sift through the rubble, all we find are pieces. They don't give you a chance. Not a chance to breathe. 100 people killed here, 80 there, 50 over there. They have nothing to do with the fighting. These are the inhabitants of Baghdad, unquote. And what about the weaponry? You recall the orchestration about the use of chemical weapons by the Iraqi armed forces. Centered, by the way, on a particular story concerning the gassing of the Kurdish population by Saddam Hussein and his army. Well, the Kurds have been subject to terrible oppression in Iraq and Iran, in Turkey, without question. But with respect to this particular story, to its credit, the San Francisco Chronicle on January 30th ran the following. Newt Royce, the reporter of the Washington Bureau of New York's Newsday, has found official reports establishing that the evidence that Iraq gassed the Kurds is flimsy, according to officials who have reviewed the classified material, the United States Army study of the Iran-Iraq War. U.S. analysts have reviewed the photographs and determined that the Kurds in Halabja died of cyanide gas, producing telltale blue lips on the corpses, and only the Iranians possessed the cyanide gas. The conclusion of the Army War College team that reviewed the intelligence is that the Kurds were killed by an Iranian bombardment. They know that. You see, the demonization of Saddam Hussein has a particular irony attached to it because Saddam Hussein, as I will discuss in a moment, has been their man in Baghdad since 1963. Brought into power by Bruce T. Odell, the head of CIA station in Baghdad. The young Saddam Hussein, a CIA asset in place. The willed and contrived and elaborate deception. Chemical weapons. This is Time magazine, February 25th, on the weaponry that has been used against the civilian population of Iraq. Fuel air explosives, the deadliest non-nuclear bombs in the Allied arsenal, disperses a highly volatile mist over a large area. When the cloud is ignited in a second explosion, the resulting blast packs nearly the wallop of a small nuclear device. The bombs suck up oxygen, pulling the lungs and organs of the victims out of their bodies. The mist from the fuel air bombs is detonated, creating an ocean of fire. They have an updated version of napalm called Interdel. This gooey gel produces a hellish inferno, burning up everything in the target area. The bombing has been characterized by what they call Willy Peter, or white phosphorus, a chemical that cannot be extinguished, that is accelerated in its impact by water, that eats into bone and flesh. Fragmentation bombs. The Gator bomb, a version of cluster bomb that explodes, scattering tiny slivers of steel over an area of 90,000 square yards. Razor-sharp slivers of steel that slice like a machete, flying out in all directions. The Lazy Dog, which is a pellet bomb, 10,000 tiny steel pellets traveling at great velocity that perforate the victim's pancreas and liver and brain, rendering them inoperable. Used throughout this bombardment and usable only against human flesh. This has been a war against the population of Iraq to destroy the infrastructure of that society. On September 18th, the Foreign Ministry of Iraq published verbatim the transcripts of meetings held between high-ranking U.S. officials and Saddam Hussein days before Iraqi troops entered Kuwait on August 2nd. James McCartney, who is a columnist for the Knight Ridder newspaper's Washington bureau, confirmed that these transcripts are, quote, not disputed by the State Department. On the 25th of July, April Glasby, the U.S. ambassador, informed Saddam Hussein in her official capacity, "We have no position on conflicts like your disagreement with Kuwait." She repeated this several times. To make sure the point was taken, she stated, "Secretary of State James Baker has directed our official spokesman to emphasize this instruction." Yes, indeed. Baker's official spokesperson, Margaret Tutwiler, and Assistant Secretary of State John Kelly, quote, both did exactly that. A week before the invasion, both repeated publicly that the United States would not come to Kuwait's aid if it were attacked, unquote. Now James McCartney is incredulous in reviewing the heavy-handedness with which the message was conveyed to Saddam Hussein. Quote, at one point in the conversation, Glasby interrupted Saddam Hussein and said, "But I have direct instructions from President Bush on this point." 2 days before Iraqi troops entered Kuwait, Assistant Secretary of State John Kelly asked to appear before the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee, where Representative Lee Hamilton, a Democrat from Indiana, asked him, "Does the United States have any intention or obligation to come to Kuwait's defense?" unquote. And later, Hamilton would recall Kelly before the subcommittee and remind him of this colloquy. He said, "I asked you if there were a U.S. commitment to come to Kuwait's defense if it were attacked. And your response over and over again was, no, we have no such obligation for Kuwait and no defense treaty relationship with any Gulf country, unquote. McCartney, like Lee Hamilton, concludes, the United States, with deliberation, gave Saddam Hussein a green light for invasion. George Bush opened the door, Saddam Hussein walked through, and much blood will be shed as a result, unquote. Similar conclusion was reached by the New York Daily News, but with a rather interesting twist. In its lead editorial on September 29th, assessing Iraq, the blame can wait, the editorial states, the State Department induced Saddam Hussein to think that it was approved for him to enter Kuwait. Reciting the uncontested facts, the editorial concludes, small wonder Saddam concluded he could overrun Kuwait. Bush and company gave him every reason to think they approved it. And the newspaper concludes rather cold-bloodedly that this is embarrassing and the crisis would get tighter and tougher. But they said there will be plenty of time to examine the policy when the smoke clears in Baghdad, preferably with tweezers and a microscope. That's for after the war. The editorial concludes, for now, George Bush deserves plenty of credit for his impeccable handling of this crisis, but he deserves particular credit for allowing the crisis to happen in the first place. They set him up. The Los Angeles Times bears this out. November 24th. General H. Norman Schwarzkopf, head of U.S. Central Command, commander of all U.S. forces. 2 weeks before the invasion, Schwarzkopf convened his top commanders. They carried out an exercise that simulated exactly the logistical circumstances of the Iraqi attack on Kuwait. Quote, the similarities were eerie. When the real thing came, the only way we could tell the real intelligence from the practice was the little T in the corner of the paper. T for training. Professor Michael Clare of Berkeley and the Christic Institute have secured a copy of a white paper prepared for the National Security Council last May. Iraq and Saddam Hussein put forward as the optimum contenders to replace the Warsaw Pact as a justification for major military expenditure. See, they were looking for a war in Patagonia. It's an economy addicted to arms production like an addict needs his fix in ever-increasing doses. The collapse of Stalinism, the rise of the workers in East Europe, in the Soviet Union, freed their hand, but also presented them with a problem for explaining to the American people why they needed to maintain military production on this scale. Tom Wicker, New York Times, for 10 long years before the Iraqi invasion, Reagan in office for 8 and Bush for 2, armed Saddam Hussein, prompted his war with Iran. And in the last days, before Saddam Hussein attacked Kuwait, the Bush administration gave him the green light, specifically. Tom Wicker. You see, it's not the crisis which is new, nor is it the evil which has changed. It's rather that this scenario has been in preparation by the National Security Council for 30 years. Every U.S. administration since 1964 has prepared for the seizure of Gulf oil, for the seizure of Arab oil. Now, one of the facets of the willed deception has to do with the claim that the Iraqi army in Kuwait was massive. Schwarzkopf stated at a press briefing after the devastation of Iraq that they were outnumbered. He had to do a Hail Mary, remember? A flanking operation. Here's a piece in December 3rd Newsweek called Where Are the Troops? Exclusive. It's the case of the missing military presence. Since Operation Desert Shield began, the Pentagon has been providing regular updates on Iraq's supposed military buildup in Kuwait. In late August, The Pentagon reported 150,000 Iraqi troops and 1,500 tanks in Kuwait. In mid-September, the Pentagon said there were 265,000 Iraqi troops and 2,200 tanks in Kuwait and southern Iraq. Now Newsweek has been told that American experts are puzzled by a set of 5 Soviet satellite pictures of eastern Kuwait and southern Arabia that show no Iraqi military presence. ABC bought the photos from the Soviet commercial satellite agency Soyuz Carter, but the network finds them so bewildering it will not air them. To analyze the photos, 2 experts, George Washington University professor Peter Zimmerman, a member of the U.S. Arms Control Agency in the Reagan administration, and a former Defense Intelligence Agency photo analyst, examined the satellite photos. When the pair looked at the shots, they were astounded. We turned to each other and we both said, "There's nothing there." They found no trace of an Iraqi military presence anywhere in Kuwait. They could see in crystal clear detail the U.S. buildup in Saudi Arabia. Well, look, the emir had a force de minimis, a tiny little guard. It didn't require hundreds of thousands of soldiers to depose the emir of Kuwait. There was no massive Iraqi army in Kuwait. Well, then why? Here is the Pentagon analyst Robert Tucker in 1974 describing the scenario which we now know as Desert Shield and its rationale. He calls the Arab shoreline of the Gulf a new El Dorado awaiting its conquistador. The one area that will satisfy our requirements extends from Kuwait down along the coastal region to Qatar. This mostly shallow coastal strip, less than 400 miles in length, that provides 40% of present OPEC production, the cartel whose ability to determine price structures we wish to eliminate. And since the area has no substantial centers of population and is without trees, its control will not bear remote comparison with our experience in Vietnam. Over and again, many of you may have seen this man's articles in the op-ed pages of the LA Times and the New York Times, a man named Edward Litvak. He's always presented as a pundit, a Middle Eastern scholar. Well, in 1975, Edward Litvak prepared a position paper for the Pentagon called Seizing Arab Oil. At that time, he was identified as a Pentagon consultant with intimate links to high-level U.S. policymakers. How come they don't tell us that when he writes from the LA Times? They developed a rapid deployment and airstrike scenario, the 82nd Airborne Division, strengthened by air cavalry battalions, will embark on giant C-5 and C-141 transports, drop paratroops at Saudi oil fields, escorted by fleets of Phantom fighters based on Israeli fields and aboard carriers in the Arabian Sea, paving the way for large Marine divisions to arrive on the scene 72 hours later. Edward Litvak also describes another Pentagon plan. In 1975, the principal figure for maintaining U.S. control of the region was the Shah of Iran. You know how the Shah of Iran was restored to power after the National Front of Mossadegh in Iran had been elected to power, nationalized British petroleum, mobilized the population in support of Iranian control over their oil resources. The Central Intelligence Agency prepared a coup, and a gentleman who had previously been the head of the state police in New Jersey, famous for having framed up Bruno Hauptmann, the accused in the kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby, then a high official of the OSS, and then a point man for the Central Intelligence Agency, prepared the coup in Tehran, which led to the deposing of Mossadegh, the reinstatement of the Shah, and the creation of the the Savak, secret police of Iran trained by the Mossad. But the man who did all that was the father of H. Norman Schwarzkopf. Comes of appropriate lineage for the job assigned to him. And in 1975, Edward Litvak describes how the Pentagon had a role for the Shah to play. He will be asked discreetly to occupy Kuwait and appropriate their oil. It's a scenario set forward in the United States National Security Council detailed top-secret Department of Defense plan to invade Arabian oil fields. February 9th, 1975, codenamed Tehran Option 4, drawn up by the Pentagon, providing for a United States attack on Saudi oil fields at Ghavar. The attack to be led by 9 airborne infantry battalions based in North Carolina, flown under escort to Dhahran in the Gulf by way of the Israeli airfield at Hatsarim, seizing the oil fields at Dhahran, moving inland to Ghavar, capturing the jetties, the storage tanks, joined 3 days later by Marine divisions sent to the Gulf by sea. Over and again. Jimmy Carter's PD-18, 25th of August, 1977. Same scenario, except with one little change. The Shah was now to take over Saudi Arabia, depose the royal family. It was formulated very explicitly by Pentagon analyst Lawrence Mosher in January of 1979. And that timing is of importance because this great unfolding revolution in Iran was to depose the Shah in February of 1979. And this is what Lawrence Mosher and the Pentagon were attempting to put in place. The U.S. 100,000-man quick strike force consisting of divisions rapidly deployable. But, as defense officials say, we need a real boogeyman to come in and have to be stopped before we can sell this to the American people. And it may turn out that boogeyman may not be defined the same in Arabic as in English. So here's Harper's, seizing Arab oil. That's what we're dealing with. And there is a particular history. Another one of the deceptions that has been imposed upon us by the powers that be through the good offices of the media is that this recent candidate for Hitler, Saddam Hussein, first it was Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Hitler of the Nile, and Gaddafi, Hafez al-Assad, now Saddam Hussein, our man in Baghdad. Another one of the deceptions that has been imposed upon us by the powers that be through the good offices of the media is that this recent candidate for Hitler, Saddam Hussein, first it was Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Hitler of the Nile, and Gaddafi, Hafez al-Assad, now Saddam Hussein, our man in Baghdad. They told us there was no relationship between Iraq and Kuwait. There was but the unhinged ambitions of this despot, some localized version of Lebensraum. Lebensraum meaning the need for space. Well, every Iraqi government from 1890 to the present day has attempted to recover its amputated district of Kuwait. Kuwait, for millennia, was an integral part of Mesopotamia. The access to the sea, the location of the trade routes, all the colonial documents confirm. Indeed, the British set out to amputate Kuwait with deliberation in order to consolidate their control over the Indian subcontinent at the time of the rise of the Indian national movement in the 1890s. And in particular, they aspired to dismantle the Ottoman Empire. And they determined that they wanted to gain control of the littoral, cutting off the Arabian hinterland from access to the sea. And they approached the two elder brothers of the local sheikh of a small village called Kut, which means small human settlement. It's diminutive for Kuwait. There was a clan that had emigrated from the Nejd in eastern Arabia, the Asaba clan, and the sheikh was a local ruler in the small fishing village of Kut. The British got hold of the elder brothers of the sheikh and they said, "You become our military agents here." And the two men refused. Indeed, when they attempted to organize resistance, the British had them killed. And that concentrated the mind of Mubarak Asaba, who agreed to become the agent of the British until the Ottoman Sultan found out about this, confronted the local sheikh, understood that he had done this at gunpoint, and appointed him prefect of the Qadha, or district of Kuwait, in the Liwa, or province of Basra. For the next 15 years, the British conspired to amputate Kuwait without success. It required the First World War, in which the Ottoman Empire was indeed dismantled. And now the Arab nations were divided up between the British and French between them. The British installed in Baghdad the Hashemite family they had driven out of Medina with the aid of the Wahhabi clan of Saud. King Faisal I. But King Faisal I attempted to build a railway to his port city of Kut and to establish a port which the British obstructed by force. The government said to the British, "But this is our territory." And the death of King Faisal I under less than clear circumstances did not help things for the British. King Razi I declared that Kuwait is an integral part of Iraq. The government of Razi I was not willing to accept its amputation and severance. This was the position throughout the 20s and 30s. The British, through the San Remo agreements in 1921, had set up a petroleum corporation dividing up the petroleum assets between France, Britain, and the United States, and in particular asserting control over Kuwait. Even the local feudal imposed regime resisted this naked colonial severance of their southern territory. And now what gives way is no longer a dispute between rulers, but the rise of a national movement in Kuwait called the Free Kuwaiti Movement. The national bloc, which reached insurrectional proportions, such that the first legislative council had to be conceded by the Sheikh in 1938 in Kuwait. And the first act of that legislative council was to declare the reunion with Iraq, whereupon the British dissolved the council, arrested, tortured, and executed its members, and now the group of Free Kuwaitis submitted a mass petition appealing to the Iraqi government to support their demand for the immediate reversion of Kuwait to Iraq. When on March 7th, 1939, the Free Kuwaitis sent telegrams to King Razi and appealed for Iraqi intervention. Baghdad radio broadcast the appeal at that time. "Our history supports the return of Kuwait to the Iraqi motherland. We shall live and die under our own national sovereignty, under our Iraqi flag. Razi, help your brethren of Kuwait." On March 10th, 1939, an armed uprising began against the ruling authority in Kuwait. The British intervened and crushed it, killing and imprisoning most of its participants. And now King Razi went on the radio and appealed to the League of Nations. He demanded an end to all repressive measures against the Free Kuwaiti movement, the release of its detainees, and British Ambassador Peterson summoned King Razi and warned him to cease public support for the Free Kuwaiti movement. Razi refused. On April 5th, 1939, he was found dead. The British said they found him in an automobile, universally believed to have been assassinated. And the British now